Hey everyone, this is Noah Zerby. In this video series, we look at the United Nations system. This video focuses in particular on the contemporary issues facing the United Nations. Specifically, we're going to look at the UN budget, the veto power, Security Council reform, and efforts at addressing gender equity in the United Nations system. In other videos, we look at the historical origins of the United Nations, its structure, functions, as well as its peacekeeping operations. So let's go ahead and get started. So in previous videos, we outlined the major institutional arrangements of the United Nations. Now we're going to look at what the UN actually does. The UN is built around three pillars, the three principal areas of concern that define the activities of the organization. These are outlined in the UN Charter. First, the maintenance of peace and security and the establishment of peaceful relations among states. This includes the work of the Security Council, the good offices of the Secretary General, and numerous other activities in this area. Second, the promotion of development. Many of the UN specialized agencies fall into this category, such as the UN Development Program, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and the UN Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, among others. And third, the promotion and protection of human rights. This includes the UN's work with refugees, for example, by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or activities like crafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. While the three pillars were normally presented as distinct areas of emphasis for the UN, the organization increasingly recognizes the interconnected nature of the three pillars. Perhaps nowhere is this more clearly recognized than in the Sustainable Development Goals, which explicitly connects all three areas under the rubric of sustainable development. Funding for UN operations comes primarily from member states in the form of assessments and voluntary contributions. Assessments are basically the dues paid by all UN member states. They're divided into regular assessments, basically annual dues, and special assessments that are dedicated to specific projects like peacekeeping operations. Some UN specialized agencies like the World Health Organization or the International Atomic Energy Agency may have regular assessments that are independent of the broader UN budget. Assessments are reevaluated every 3 years based on a formula that takes into account a country's ability to pay. It begins with per capita gross domestic product and makes adjustments based on the level of debt and other considerations. For regular assessments, the formula imposes a ceiling of 22% and a floor of 0.001%. In other words, no country will ever contribute more than 22% of the UN's regular budget, and no country's assessment will ever be less than 1,000% of the UN budget. Special assessments do not impose a ceiling, which means the United States pays about 28% of the peacekeeping budget, a proportion equal to its share of global wealth. In terms of regular assessments, the United States is the single largest contributor, responsible for about 22% of the regular budget, or about $368 million in 2018. Voluntary contributions are just that, voluntary contributions by member states to programs they wish to support. Programs like the World Food Program are funded entirely by voluntary contributions, and as a result are frequently short on resources. The United Nations also receives grants from some international foundations. Between 2015 and 2018, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation granted the United Nations about $30 million per year. This would make the Gates Foundation the 25th largest funder of the UN, putting it just after Argentina and just ahead of Sweden in rank order. The top 10 contributors to the UN budget, in rank order, the US, China, Japan, Germany, the UK, France, Italy, Brazil, Canada, and Russia, fund over 69% of the UN budget, and the top 15 contributors fund about 78%. About 30 countries, like Belize, Sierra Leone, and Somalia, paid the floor figure of 1,000% of the UN budget. In dollar terms, this equated to about $30,000 each towards the UN regular budget. What is all this money used for? This figure shows the 20 largest expenditures for the United Nations, each in billions of dollars in 2016. The regular budget, about $5.6 billion, includes all the regular expenses of the organization, the facilities, maintenance, salaries, the cost of running meetings, as well as the cost of special missions. The single largest expense, peacekeeping operations, came in at $8.9 billion in 2016. This is financed through special assessment on member states. The finances for many of the key organizations like the World Food Program at $5.4 billion or the Agency for Palestinian Refugees at $1.3 billion are paid for entirely through voluntary contributions by member states. Finally, some organizations like UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, rely on a combination of voluntary contributions by member states and fundraising efforts by individual people around the world. Because the United Nations relies on funding secured primarily from its member states, it's constantly running short on money. Put simply, there's a constant tension inside the United Nations system between the countries that want to expand UN operations and assistance and the countries that pay for them. Developed countries in particular often feel they pay too much and watch UN spending closely. The United Nations also regularly has a problem with unpaid dues. As of August 2019, outstanding payment for unpaid dues totaled more than $1 billion for regular dues and $2.27 billion for UN peacekeeping operations. The majority of countries around the world were behind in their regular assessment of dues, and the United States had the single largest amount in arrears, in part because the U.S. regularly withholds a portion of its assessment to protest policies it opposes. The primary avenue to force member states to pay their dues is one that the UN is hesitant to impose. Member states in arrears can have their vote in the General Assembly withheld if they owe more than twice their annual assessment. States can petition for a waiver of this penalty if they're suffering from factors beyond their control. In September 2019, 7 member states were potentially subject to having their votes withheld, and 4 of them, Comoros, Sao Tome and Principe, and Somalia, currently have their votes suspended. This can change regularly, so to get the most current information on member state dues and voting status, you can follow the link at the bottom of this page. All of this has led to discussions of UN reform, and the UN has regularly revisited its budget and funding models. More radical proposals, like a tax on global financial transactions to pay for UN operations, are steadfastly opposed by member states who fear a more independent United Nations. As a result, proposals for reform appear to be confined to tinkering on the margins and hoping for improvements. The second contemporary issue I want to address is that of Security Council veto power. You'll recall from previous videos that the permanent members of the Security Council, the so-called P5, have the power to veto any proposed substantive measure before the Council. This means that any one of the permanent members can block Council action. But how has the veto power played out over time, and what's its role today? Let's look at the use of veto over time. This graph charts the number of Security Council vetoes by country by year from the 1940s through 2018. What can we learn? China has made less frequent use of the veto power than any other Security Council country, vetoing just 11 resolutions in its history, most often in conjunction with Russian vetoes. China has only twice vetoed a resolution by itself. One veto was for a resolution dealing with the situation in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia in 1999. The other was in 1997, when it vetoed a resolution dealing with a crisis and deployment of peacekeeping forces to Guatemala, where it cited Guatemala's support for Taiwan as its reason for opposition to the resolution. France has made use of its veto a total of 16 times since 1946, most often in unison with the United States and the United Kingdom. France last used its veto on a resolution in 1989 and has only used its veto once unilaterally in a 1976 vote on a resolution dealing with Comoros. Russia and the USSR have made more frequent use of the veto than any other country, vetoing a total of 112 resolutions over the past 72 years, an average of about 1.5 vetoes per year or 3 resolutions every 2 years. However, Soviet use of the veto power follows an interesting trend, with extensive use early on, falling off through the middle years, and Russian use increasing in recent years. The USSR was the first country to make use of its veto power in February 1946, just 1 month after the first meeting of the organization. Into the early 1960s, the Soviet Union regularly vetoed membership applications from states it viewed as being too closely allied with the United States. Remember that in the early days of the United Nations, the organization was composed disproportionately of European and Latin American states, most of which were closely aligned with the United States. As a result, the USSR regularly used its veto to prevent action it thought undermined its position in the world. It also used the veto to prevent the expansion of United Nations membership, threatening to veto any application until all of the Soviet Socialist republics, basically the states that comprise the Soviet Union, were granted membership. Indeed, the early frequent use of the veto power by the Soviet Union earned their ambassador the nickname Mr. Veto. Soviet use of the veto power declined into the 1970s as the tenor of the organization became more anti-American as a result of increasing membership from the post-colonial countries of Africa and Asia. However, in recent years, since the early 2000s, Russia has increased its use of the veto power, and in recent years has vetoed numerous resolutions dealing with the situation in Syria and the broader Middle East. The United Kingdom has used its veto 29 times, 7 of which were related to the situation in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe between 1963 and 1973. 5 of these were unilateral vetoes, the only time the UK has used its veto unilaterally rather than in conjunction with vetoes by the United States and France. The UK last used its veto power in 1989, jointly vetoing a resolution alongside France and the United States dealing with the crisis in Panama. And finally, the United States. The US has used its veto power a total of 81 times. Its first use did not occur until 1970, when it and the United Kingdom blocked UN action on Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Since then, and as the United Nations membership has come to be dominated by post-colonial states in the Global South, the United States has made more frequent use of the veto power. The United States has used its veto power primarily to protect Israel. The use of the veto power has been guided by the Negroponte Doctrine since 2002. Under the Negroponte Doctrine, named for John Negroponte, the U.S. ambassador to the UN from 2001 to 2004 and later Director of National Intelligence and Deputy Secretary of State, the U.S. will veto any resolution that fails to meet 4 conditions. It must condemn all terrorism in general. It must condemn Al-Aqsa, Islamic Jihad, and Hamas by name. It must include an appeal for a political settlement to the crisis. And it must condition Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories on an improvement in the security situation. In the 1990s, the use of the veto declined dramatically. Facing the threat of veto, sponsors of resolutions would often choose to withdraw the resolution from consideration rather than have it vetoed. This was the case, for example, when France opposed the U.S. draft resolution authorizing the use of force in Iraq in 2003. On the other hand, forcing a vote that is vetoed can also send a political message. Thus, the U.S. forced a vote condemning Syrian aggression in 2014. That resolution was vetoed by Russia despite receiving 14 votes in favor. Recent practice of selecting the Secretary General has similarly avoided the use of the veto by holding straw polls behind closed doors until one candidate is agreed to. This chart presents the same information that we just looked at, presented here by decade. Here we can see broad tendencies in the pattern of usage of the veto, with early use of the veto by the USSR through the 1960s, followed by an increase in usage by the United States in the 1970s and 1980s. There was a decline in the use of veto after the Cold War, but it looks like it's starting to pick up again. The veto power grants the P5 considerable power and influence on the global stage. Not surprisingly, there's been extensive discussion about the need for Security Council reform and the possibility of adding additional permanent members, each of which may have the veto power. When the Security Council was created in 1945, it reflected the global distribution of power. Since then, things have changed. France and the United Kingdom play a less important role in the world, and arguably countries like India, Japan, Germany, and Brazil play a more important one. The problem is that reform of the Security Council requires the consent of the P5 due to their veto power. Given that no permanent member is likely to voluntarily give up its own veto, the only possibility is to expand the number of permanent members. Proposals have included simply adding some mix of countries with veto power to creating a new class of permanent members without a veto power. These are all imperfect solutions. Increasing the size of the Council would make arriving at consensus decisions more difficult, possibly undermining its role in collective security. Further, the constellation of countries that might gain a seat provokes specific reactions from the P5 depending upon the mix. While India seems to have the support of most of the P5, other proposals run into opposition in various areas. Adding Germany would increase Europe's voice on the Council, undermining the relative position of non-European members. China is at best lukewarm on Japan's application, and Africa remains underrepresented on the Council in most reform proposals. Thus, prospects for reform of the Council appear to be limited. In addition to the budget problems in the UN Security Council reform, gender equity has become a primary focal point for attention of the organization. Historically, women have been underrepresented in the UN, particularly at its highest levels. In the weeks leading up to the election of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, there was considerable interest in electing the organization's first female leader. While that bid failed, Guterres did commit to achieving gender parity at all levels of UN operations. He ordered the development of a system-wide strategy to achieve gender parity, and considerable progress has been made, particularly in the lower and middle-level positions across the organization. Some organs within the UN, particularly those focused on security, and the most senior-level positions in the Secretariat remain disproportionately male, but even there progress is being made. The goal, as outlined by Guterres, is to ensure equal representation in senior leadership by 2021 and have equal gender representation across all boards by 2028. That concludes our consideration of contemporary issues before the UN. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.